Welcome to the 2023 Summer LCS Power Rankings by me, Markz, the walkout edition. That's right, I'm recording this after the 2-week break. There's going to be 6 weeks only with 3 games a week for each team. I might talk about that with some of these teams about how much time they're going to have to acclimate or if the players are still missing. I don't know exactly how it's going to influence it, but it's going to be worth noting. Anyways, this is going to be my power rankings. We're going to start at the bottom, work our way up. Again, this is projecting towards the end of the regular season finish, and we'll see how things change from there. So let's dig into it, starting with number 10. So my number 10 is Dignitas. I think purely on name potential here with Jensen Santorin, if Rich comes in and does all right, the fact that we saw Tomo when he stepped up into Spring Split seemed to revitalize the team a little bit. Diamond we haven't seen in a minute, but he's usually doing quite well in the tier 2 scene. Whatever. The reality is that, like, on paper, this team can be okay. I have not been impressed with some of the org stuff. I was kind of alluding to this a little bit when I was talking about it on the dive. And, I don't mean to say, like, it's the actual managers working there or anything, but I just heard this is not, like, much support given to these group of guys. I don't know what headspace they're in after a really disappointing last split. I've heard a grumbling or two after I put them 10th, after I already thought that I had concerns that scrims have not been going well for them. So it seems to kind of confirm what I already was worried about. So don't expect much out of this roster. I don't think that's a death knell on any of these players personally. I just think there's sometimes you get into environments where it's just like, it feels doomed, and maybe I'll be surprised. Maybe they get on stage 2 and they win a game or two and it gives them some confidence and they can like break their mental state. But I feel like if this team starts slowly, they're going to be in hot water, and I don't see them really being that competitive this split. My number 9 is none other than TSM. I just don't know what to say about this squad that hasn't already been said by everyone else. TSM has put out their own video saying they're trying to leave the LCS. This is kind of their swan song. And while it's really cool to see guys like Haunter and Wild Turtle playing together again on this historic team, it's fair to say that TSM is not really investing in the future of their org or the LCS. So it's hard to be a little bit excited about them. Individual player-wise, I want to see what Chime can do. And Boogie, I thought, had a good last split. Haunter and Turtle, like I said, already excited to see them play. Ruby, based off what we saw out of him in the LEC, I'm just not particularly excited by this signing. It seems like one of these signings where, okay, he's not like a god-awful player. I don't hate him as a human, but why get him over any of the native NA talent if you're just going to ship it in? I'm actually way more excited to see Insanity, who will be subbing in until Ruby is here. I'm way more excited to actually see him play, to be honest. Do I expect him to do well given this team's situation? No. I think the upside is it's kind of like a fuck it mentality where that this team doesn't really care, or the org behind you. I think that people, closely knit together care. I think Revan, the coach, actually leaving C9 for this opportunity, but he's someone who I was relatively impressed by during his time on C9. And this feels like him saying hey, I'm getting a head coaching opportunity. I'm going to take it. It's a low downside where if we struggle, people aren't going to judge me because this whole roster situation is just weird with my org trying to leave. But if we overperform, it looks good for me. So I do think there's a lot of incentive for the people who are on the actual roster to care. Clearly the org is checked out at this point. And I just don't expect big things out of a team in that environment. My number 8 is Immortals, and they finished 9th last split. I think Balulu coming in for Blaze Olive, he looked decent. I think Solo joining up, I don't think he's necessarily better than Revenge, but he has this weak side play style. Tactical is a bit of a coin flip. I like Treats a lot. I'm glad he's here. I always have a good time. He's one of the pros who has done a good job of creating kind of a brand around himself a little bit, so I'm happy Treats is back. I tried to get Fleshy out there to people, but is what it is, I guess. I think can be good on certain chicks. I don't know why they still haven't really found a way to play around him. I just don't think this team has much consistent firepower. Tactical is a little too inconsistent, I think, at this point. Balulu does have the picks that are unique and weird, and outside those, can he carry frequently enough? Kenby would need to massively step up. I think Solo will be fine on this team, and I think it's more that they didn't get too much better in my mind, and more that TSM, who was above them last split, is probably going to do worse and drop below them. This roster is very similar to me to last split with some little tweaks to it, but I don't think that they'll be able to consistently pick up wins. Alrighty, time for my most contentious pick by far, I think, this split. It's 100 Thieves at 7th. Now, people are quick to throw the hater label at me, and, in the sense that I'm projecting not great things out of them. Sure, I'm a hater, but, I put them 3rd last split. People call me crazy for that. They finished 3rd. I take those. But if I'm being honest, I was wrong in a lot of ways. This team was a big disappointment. And the changes that they made, to me, are mostly side grades. I think Someday for Tenacity will be an upgrade. Someday hasn't really often been the defining feature of a lot of the teams that he's been on, he's been a good, solid top laner on the top side. And I think he'll have less downsides and some more upsides than Tenacity, but he's not going to fundamentally recreate how this team plays, I don't think. Quid coming in is the interesting one. I think he'll be more aggressive than Bjergsen. I think he will pop off individually a couple more times, but I think Bjergsen has become popular to hate on. And there's times where he did very good things for this team and helped them win games with like Talia flicks in some of these situations. There are times where he was invisible and people really don't like that out of him. So I think people will be happier with Quid, especially since he's a younger player. But I think strictly in terms of game impact, I don't think he will cause more wins to come to 100 Thieves than Bjergsen was doing. I think he's probably a slight downgrade. There's a chance that there were too many cooks, and like Bjergsen stepping out enables like new ways that this team works together behind the scenes to like unlock higher carry potential or something like that. But I don't think it's just because like Quid's going to be so much better individually. So that's like, I guess the positive spin on this is like someday in Quid might be easier to work with for the team, for them to like figure out an identity, because Closer and Doublelift obviously have loud voices. But if it's just a strictly skill situation, I don't think that this team is suddenly much better than they were in spring. And people go, well, Mark, they got third in spring. And I go, yeah, but like you have to like squint your eyes and ignore everything that happened for the majority of that split and just look at like the last 2 weeks to see why they got third. But like there's all these other problems. They were horrible in late games. Their early games were not particularly good. They were really struggling to find any sort of identity. And then they settled on this like protect the jinx late game where they just slammed the same draft like 8 games in a row in the regular season to rip off a ton of these wins and shoot up the standings and actually qualify not only for playoffs, but all the way up to third. But I would make the case that they were the weakest team in playoffs. They lost both their best of fives. It was a close one versus Golden Guardians, but Golden Guardians was still kind of on their upward trajectory where they just kept getting better and better every week, it felt like. And it was in that 100 Thieves series where Licorice swapped from being like this weak side, no carry top lane player to being like, just give me the ball, I'm gonna do a lot of good things. And then from there, Licorice continued to do that. So they kind of caught Golden Guardians in this inflection point in their play style, and it wasn't close after that, it felt like, in a lot of ways. Game 5 was close technically, but I don't think 100 Thieves was legitimately a good team. I think if you look at that split as a whole, they had a lot of problems and they patched them up and did a single play style that worked. And they rode that because people don't pay as much attention and don't target ban as hard in the regular season as they will in the best of fives. And that got exposed quickly after that. I do think there's a case to be made that this team can play that way that they were playing at the end of the season. Like Doublelift and Busio are still there. Currently in the current meta, late game hyper carries are still decent. It's pretty bot lane meta again, it feels like. So yeah, they can just play this play style. Obviously, you have Someday who's happy to play on the top side of the map. Quid is the question mark if he'll fit into like a bot lane Doublelift style centric play style. And I know that people were saying like, well, he was good in Challenger, but he wasn't like setting the world on fire. He wasn't like one of these guys that like is like, oh, I can't wait to see him fucking play. He's not like Berserker level. I think this team was realistically 6th, 7th last split, and I think this is mostly a side grade. And so I don't think the LCS as a whole got much better around them, to be fair, but I think unless something changes with how this team operates, they might still struggle. And I guess the X factor to include in this is Kane. Kane came and joined this roster. There were clearly coaching problems that this team was having. Maybe Kane can help unite them, and I actually do like Kane quite a bit. And so if there's one reason that I'm wrong, I think it will be this like team synergy plus coaching X kind of angle that will boost them up the standings. And I do think, to be fair, I didn't say this at the top of the video, I should have. I think 1, 2, 3 is like pretty certain, but anything in like 9, 10 is like relatively certain. 8, 9, 10 is relatively certain, but 7 through 4th feels very, very open. And even 3rd, depending on if Golden Guardian struggles a little bit more in the regular season this time around or something like that, or one of the other teams slumps. But like putting them 7th, I could be very wrong, and they could again end up 4th or something like that, and I wouldn't be too shocked. I'm not like hard on the 100 Thieves is the 7th best team, and anyone who doesn't agree with me is fucking crazy. I don't have that perspective. I'm just saying that, like, calling my shot here. But again, who knows? I could be wrong. Speaking of teams that did not look good in the regular season last split, Team Liquid, who finished 8th. Why do I have faith in Team Liquid if I don't have any in 100 Thieves? I don't know, because I'm an idiot. Honestly, I don't know why I keep drinking this Kool-Aid, but I'm drinking it again, and it's probably poison, and I'm going to vomit everywhere from how this team fails to close out games. I think there were a lot of fundamental problems with this team. They had crazy good early games. That's the one thing that like this team had that like 100 Thieves didn't, was they did have a legitimate strong point throughout the entire season that I would expect to still largely be there this split, which is they were really good in the early game. Where they failed was they were one of the worst teams we have ever seen in the mid to late game and found ways to consistently throw games where any other team in the league probably wins from that position. So that is a huge problem to fix. They did have a coaching change as well. I heard some behind the scenes stuff. Didn't sound like Marin was doing a great job. Reignover will be maybe better at solidifying some of this stuff. And I think that this is a team that underperformed last split relative to what they said was happening in scrims, relative to what we were seeing in the early games. Fixing late game is really hard. This is not like a negligible, like, oh, well, they'll figure that out. It's not a big deal. Like, it is a big deal to try and get better at late game when you are a team that is fundamentally terrible at it. It's a really hard part of the game to practice and improve on with how scrims work, as I've covered many times before. So I don't have a ton of confidence that this team will get significantly better than 8th, but I think 6 is on the table. I think it's something where just being slightly better and winning a couple more of those games that they dropped, like just a couple more, where they had leads and then threw them, like, okay, this team can probably get 6th. I'm still disappointed with the 8th, and I'm honestly disappointed with the 6th, given how excited I was for this roster to come together and their approach and mentality and all that stuff. And I am still pessimistic relative to where I was coming in at the start of spring. But yeah, I just think that the consistent early games that they have, and their late game getting short up a little bit, the fact that they didn't change any individual players out, maybe they'll make some improvements and then be able to just kind of hit the ground running, which is something, to be fair, to be said about 100 Thieves I didn't say, was it sounds like Quid won't be here on week 1, and you played 3 games during that time period. And so if they drop some games because their whole team's not here, and any of the other teams might be having, I don't know, the visa situation of everyone, like Insanity is playing probably instead for TSM, like at least for Team Liquid, it's the same 5 guys that you played with all year long, back together again, no visa issues, ready to play. So like they might have a little bit more momentum in the early game, or in the early portions of the split, the same way a couple of the other teams above them in the standings do as well. This brings me to number 5, EG, which is another bit of a shot that I'm trying to call here. Again, the middle of the standings are very fluid. I think this EG lineup is pretty good for what was happening in the middle of the split. When they blew up their roster and put that post out about, like, we believe in NA, whatever they said, I don't remember. I was like, what the hell, dude? This team's going to be, like, bottom of the barrel. They're going to be terrible. And then they get Unforgiven, and then they get Revenge and Armeo, and I'm like, okay. And then Ayla's kind of the question mark for me. But, like, on paper, if they're playing well, JoJo and Unforgiven are top 3 carries in critical carry roles. Revenge is someone who is off of Immortal's prison, which I'm excited to see. Armeo, I think, has been someone who the scene sometimes gets like a feeling of who a player is, and they start to discredit them because they think they know them. And even though they're good, they're like, well, it's not a sexy signing, and like he's just like a control. He's like Santorin light, and I'm not really interested. I think Armeo is someone who, if the team is playing well, can play a very good supportive control style jungler to prop up the rest of the team. And so it really does depend on if JoJo and Unforgiven are kind of vibing and Revenge is doing decently in the top side. Like, I think Armeo can do a good job playing around JoJo, playing around Unforgiven. The question is, Ayla, is he actually as bad as he looked on FlyQuest this last split, or was that like joining in the middle after visa issues, and like it sounded like the team was already struggling a little bit internally anyways, and maybe the public perception got to him and Vulcan was throwing shade at him, and like maybe, you know, his rookie brain just overloaded, and he'll be better here in like a lower stress situation. I think more JoJo, he was terrible in spring, and so if he shows up with that level of performance, they are not getting 5th if he shows up with that level of performance. He needs to step up. He needs to go back to like summer playoff run when he was like hulking out on Swain and like just making plays all over the map. He needs to get back to that level if this team is actually going to get 5th. You know, I don't think this team is like insanely good, probably. It will rely on some individual people stepping up. And so like there's like a lot of players here who in like contract year settings, if you're unfamiliar with the term from traditional sports, there's a tendency for pro players in their final year of their contracts to suddenly start playing better, because that will affect what their next contract is way more than like year 1 of the new contract that they just signed. And I think a lot of these guys are in that kind of situation where Revenge is out of Immortal's jail. He wants to prove that like he's actually legitimately good now that like the ankle weights are off. Armeo's finally getting shot in the LCS properly. I think he'll be very hungry. I think JoJo, seeing all his teammates go away, the one person that stuck around after a really bad spring split, needs to shape up, and he wants to show that. Unforgiven, playing in Academy after winning first team All-Pro in the LEC in summer, is like, what the hell happened to my career, guys? And he wants to show that like, hey, I'm still a fucking beast. And Ayla wants to kind of wipe the past clean of that FlyQuest split. So all 5 of these guys have like huge narrative motivations for why they should want to do well. Sometimes that means like everyone's trying a little too hard and no one like wants to take the back seat. And so maybe this roster, given that none of these guys have played together before, maybe it implodes. I guess Armeo and Ayla have played together technically, but like for the most part, it's 5 new guys. So I do think there's a concern that it's like too many cooks and everyone's trying way too hard. But if the team gels together, I actually think skill-wise, it can kind of compete. And like upper end, maybe make a push into like the Golden Guardians tier if they're really vibing. Otherwise, they're probably just outside the world time. Number 4 is NRG. I always sleep on the CLG boys. Now they're NRG. It's largely the same core. They did bring in FBI and Ignar, but I've talked in the past about how it seemed like they were kind of on a different page than Luger a lot of the times in their decision making. I feel like the backdoor weird Nexus stuff at the end of the split, like there's just a ton of examples where like clearly this team does not play in the same way. FBI, I think, was okay last split overall during the regular season. I don't blame him for a lot of the big problems that the team seemed to be having. He seems like someday like someone who just doesn't elevate a team necessarily anymore. There was a period of time where it was like, is he the best AD carry in the league? That seems to have gone as other people have come into the scene, but he is still a good AD carry. Ignar to me is actually the big one that I'm concerned about. I've not been super impressed with him in recent years. And I'm just really worried that he's going to come in here and like try and make a ton of hero plays, try and stand out and just like make mistakes. I feel like the top side of the map is very volatile. There's times where they all look like they're borderline all pro, and there's times where they're all kind of inting. And it's an inconsistent team, but a couple splits now, 2 splits in a row, they have finished in the top half of the league basically when people did not believe in them very much. And so I do have faith in this team to continue to play that well. Palafox, Contracts, and Dokla do work well together. They have a very aggressive mindset. They have interesting picks. They always had decent drafts. Sometimes they get too clever and they fuck their draft completely. But I appreciate that they're a team that's always trying things out. And I think that they're a team that can actually pick up a lot of wins in a offseason where a lot of moves happen, them included. But I've always doubted these guys. This is the one time I'm going to believe in them. We'll see, though. Oh, boy. All right. Top 3 is going to be pretty boring, to be honest. So I'll slam through these pretty quickly. Golden Guardians, number 3. I think that FlyQuest went through a lot of like weird roster turmoil with the things that were going on in the support position that kind of held them back a little bit. I think it was arguable who was better at the end of the split, really. If you didn't have them swapping Ayla in the middle of playoff or out in the middle of playoff series and Winsome coming in and this kind of stuff. Golden Guardians, though, I became believers in this team during that 7-game win streak that they ripped off. They were playing the game in a very nice fundamental way where like they have legitimate strengths that they can execute on game over game. The mid-jungle 2v2, the roaming with Huhi, sticks it kind of as this late game insurance policy. And where they really elevated it was in playoffs with Licorice finding these picks that he could find ways to positively influence the game on, carry games himself directly. And I expect all that stuff to carry over into Summer Split, given that we continue to see it at MSI. Licorice, it was not just a flash in the pan of a playoff run. Like, he legitimately looks like he's playing better. I think this team can easily punch into top 2. This team does have like a suite of all-pro potential candidates based off how they look last split. So it's a team that I expect to do very well still in summer. The MSI hangover would be a concern, but then they got like 2-ish weeks off with the walkout. So maybe the hangover is not quite as significant. And given that they have the roster consistency and we're playing this kind of like compressed split now, I think that might actually be better for a team like this who is keeping all 5 members. And you just have less practice time. It's not just that like you play more games, it's that one of those practice days is now a game day, and it's like you can't work on some of the things that you would need to iron out. And teams like Golden Guardians, even FlyQuest, since it's just the support change, C9, Team Liquid, in theory, if you have more consistency, there's less kinks to iron out, and now that there's less time to try that, you did have 2 extra weeks of practice in theory that you might not have gotten before, but that was during a walkout. I don't know what people's headspaces were during that time period. Either way, I am valuing consistency a little bit higher this split, and so I think Golden Guardians will do quite well for that reason. That brings me to number 2, FlyQuest. After their series, FlyQuest versus Golden Guardians for the 2-3 spot, I said, well, FlyQuest did lose, and I'm not saying that FlyQuest was better on the day and like bullshit happened. They still almost won that series. It did take that like Malphite play and a couple other little things in game 4 to give Golden Guardians that win. So it was legitimately very close between these 2 teams. Vulcan coming in is obviously just an individual upgrade. There's a consistency component now that you don't have this visa issue in your support position. There's a lot of reasons that I think, even if you really did think Golden Guardians was a better team at the end of last split, I think this upgrade should push FlyQuest over Golden Guardians because it was still very, very close in those series. So I think they'll still have a lot of the same problems. Like, Vicla's a bit coin flippy. There's times where, Prince is a little inty. Sometimes the team just like doesn't do a ton. Like, the early games were a little bit passive. I think Spica was good. It was sometimes like if mid jungle wasn't popping off 2v2, like Impact was just in La La Land and like Prince wasn't doing a ton. But I think Vulcan usually combos well with his jungler. And so I think, even if they're not playing directly around Prince, though I do think Vulcan is also good about setting up lane ganks, I think Vulcan will get on the map and make more things happen. It was something where both Winsome and ALS seem to struggle about like influencing the early game, and that's something that Vulcan does very well, whether it's through lane or roams. So one of the weaknesses that FlyQuest had, which was their early game, will be improved with Vulcan, not just in terms of his individual laning and hopefully synergy with Prince. This brings me to number 1, Cloud9. What do you gotta say? They were the best team last split. They're gonna be the best team again this split. I always joked about how, well, they ended with the same record pre-Eminez and after Eminez, you know? So, like, did he actually help? But, like, of course he did. Just eye test-wise, the dominance that came with him showing up, the 3 lanes of pressure that this team likes to play with, Blabber being a monster in the early game, Sven getting better and better at support. Everyone is improving on this team, it feels like, or, like, already near the top. I know people meme on Fudge for his international performances, which it's like, okay, fair enough. But domestically, he's always basically the best top laner in the season. I think that's going to happen again. This team is just stacked head to toe. Any team can always slump. I feel like slumps in League can kind of hit at any time for almost any reason. Just like you have a bad block of scrims and you start to question yourself. And like it's a very mental game. It's a very confidence-driven game, and we don't always acknowledge that. And so like at any given moment in the regular season, given that it's a compressed season, if you have 2 bad weeks out of a 6-week split, it's like a 30-year season was bad. And so in theory, any of these top 3 teams that I have listed pretty confidently here, they could drop or swap even within this category, and I wouldn't be shocked. I feel very confident about at least these 3 teams like going to Worlds most likely. When push comes to shove and you're in best of 5s and the season has slowed back down again, like I think I'm very confident about all these teams. I will admit that like, yeah, maybe something crazy happens, and you know, FlyQuest and C9 were already tied kind of for first place. They had to play a tiebreaker for it, and Cloud9 demonstrated that they were the best team in the split through playoffs and everything after Eminez joined. And I don't know if Vulcan will get them over that, but like in a world, yeah, it's possible. I don't think it's crazy. But yeah, overall, I am pretty confident in these 3 teams, and especially in Cloud9. That does it for my power rankings. We're starting tomorrow, Wednesday, in the LCS, and then every Wednesday after that. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is the new schedule for the next 6 weeks. It is a sprint and a half. It's not just for me, and it's going to be hard to make content because I'm losing a prep day and all these things, but it's also going to be hard for players to adapt to new patches and get a ton of practice in. Well, it's going to affect everyone playing on this compressed schedule. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's a little bit sloppier of a season, a little bit loosier and goosier, but that's all. It's all good. I'm from NA, baby. So see you guys then.